Captain Sarah Mitchell had always known that war would test her in ways she never imagined, but nothing had prepared her for the silence that followed General Harrison's words. The fluorescent lights in the briefing room hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the 12 officers seated around the oval table. Maps covered every surface, marked with red pins that represented more than strategic positions, they represented lives. Specter 6, the general had said, his voice cutting through the morning briefings like a blade. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a demand wrapped in 2 words that carried the weight of military protocol and something darker underneath. Sarah felt the eyes of every officer in the room turn toward her. Some held curiosity, others held pity, but most held the careful blankness that came with years of military service, the look that said they understood what those words meant, even if they pretended not to. The call sign had been hers for 3 years now. 3 years since the operation in Syria that had gone sideways, since the decision that saved 18 lives but cost her something she couldn't name. 3 years since she'd earned a reputation that followed her like a shadow through every assignment, every promotion, every sleepless night. "Sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt building in her chest. She knew what was coming. She'd known the moment she'd seen the classified folder on his desk, the one marked with the symbols that meant someone was about to ask her to make impossible choices again. General Harrison's weathered face showed no emotion as he slid the folder across the table. The sound of paper against wood seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Operation Blackwater. Classified. You'll be leading a 12-person extraction team into hostile territory. The target is a captured NATO intelligence officer. Location, approximately 40 kilometers northeast of Kandahar. Sarah's fingers closed around the folder, feeling the weight of it, not the physical weight, but the weight of everything it represented. She'd held folders like this before. They always felt heavier than they should. Timeline, she asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. 72 hours. The intel suggests the target will be moved to a more secure location by then. After that. The general's voice trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Colonel Martinez, seated to her left, cleared his throat. "General, with respect, Captain Mitchell has been in the field for 14 consecutive months. Perhaps someone else could." "Captain Mitchell has the experience for this type of operation," General Harrison interrupted, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Her track record speaks for itself." The words hit her like a physical blow. Track record. That's what they called it now. Not the nightmares that woke her at 3 a.m, not the faces she saw every time she closed her eyes, not the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. Track record. Sarah opened the folder with steady hands, her trained mind already processing the intelligence photographs, the terrain maps, the personnel files. But, underneath the professional calm, something else was stirring, a familiar darkness that she'd spent 3 years learning to control. The captured officer was Lieutenant David Park, 26 years old, father of 2 young children. His photograph showed a young man with kind eyes and a smile that reminded Sarah of her brother. The resemblance was close enough to make her breath catch, close enough to make her remember why she'd stopped looking at family photographs. "The extraction window is narrow," General Harrison continued, his voice becoming background noise as Sarah studied the mission parameters. "Intelligence suggests a 12-person security detail. Minimal civilian presence in the target area. Rules of engagement are." He paused, and, in that pause, Sarah heard everything he wasn't saying. "Flexible." She looked up from the folder to find him watching her with an expression she'd seen before. It was the look commanders got when they knew they were asking someone to carry a burden that would change them forever. It was the look that said they were sorry, but they'd ask anyway because someone had to. "Sir," she said quietly, "what aren't you telling me?" The question hung in the air for a long moment. Around the table, the other officers shifted uncomfortably. They all knew there was always more, there was always some detail, some complication that turned a difficult mission into an impossible one. General Harrison leaned back in his chair, and, for the first time that morning, he looked tired. Not just physically tired, but soul tired in the way that came from making decisions that kept other people awake at night. The intelligence officer, he was captured 3 weeks ago. This is the third extraction attempt. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. The previous teams encountered unexpected resistance. Both missions resulted in casualties. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. How many casualties? 7 Kia in the first attempt. 4 in the second. Both team leaders were among the casualties. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of helicopters landing somewhere on the base. Sarah stared at the photograph of Lieutenant Park, trying to reconcile the young father's smile with the reality of what had happened to the people who tried to save him. "Why me?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Because you get results," General Harrison said simply. "Because when you're given an impossible mission, you find a way to make it possible. Because you understand that sometimes the hardest choices are the only choices." There it was. The real reason she was sitting in this room, holding this folder, feeling the weight of another impossible decision settling on her shoulders. They weren't asking her because she was the best soldier, though she was good at what she did. They were asking her because she was willing to carry the weight of decisions that would break other people. She thought about Lieutenant Park's children, sleeping safely in their beds thousands of miles away, not knowing their father was in a cell in Afghanistan. She thought about the families of the 11 people who had already died trying to bring him home. She thought about her own team, waiting outside in the hallway, trusting her to lead them into whatever darkness this mission would bring. "I'll need to review the previous mission reports," she said finally. "Complete tactical assessments, intelligence updates, and..." She paused, forcing herself to say the words. "Casualty reports. Already prepared." General Harrison nodded to Colonel Martinez, who slid another folder across the table. This one was thicker, heavier with the weight of documented failure and documented death. Sarah took the second folder without looking at it. She could feel the eyes of every officer in the room on her, could sense the mixture of relief and guilt that came with watching someone else accept an impossible burden. They were good people, most of them. They would have taken the mission themselves if they could have. But they all knew why they wouldn't be asked. "Assembly time?" she asked. "Your team is already on standby. Departure is scheduled for 0800 tomorrow." General Harrison's voice had returned to its professional cadence, but Sarah could hear the underlying current of something else, respect, perhaps, or maybe just resignation. She closed both folders and stood, feeling the weight of them in her hands. Around the table, the other officers remained seated, their faces carefully neutral. They would finish their morning briefings, return to their offices, and try not to think about what she would be doing in 72 hours. "Sir," she said, coming to attention. "Dismissed, Captain." Sarah turned toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. Behind her, she heard General Harrison clear his throat, preparing to move on to the next item of business, the next impossible decision that someone would have to make. She was halfway to the door when he called out again. "Captain Mitchell." She turned back, folders still clutched in her hands. "Bring him home." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a father's prayer, a commander's hope, and a soldier's duty all rolled into one. Sarah nodded once, not trusting herself to speak, and walked out of the room. The hallway outside was empty except for a single figure leaning against the wall. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres looked up as she emerged, his dark eyes reading her expression with the ease of someone who'd served beside her for 2 years. "Bad one?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked down at the folders in her hands, feeling the weight of everything they contained, the photographs, the maps, the casualty reports, the impossible choices that were already beginning to form in her mind. "The worst," she said. Torres pushed himself away from the wall, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the exit. He didn't ask for details, he knew she'd brief the team when the time came. For now, it was enough to walk beside her in silence, a steady presence in the gathering storm. Outside, the Afghan sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air shimmery with heat. Sarah could see her team gathered near the motor pool, their faces turning toward her as she approached. They trusted her. They would follow her into whatever hell this mission would bring, and they trusted her to lead them out again. She thought about General Harrison's words, Specter 6, and the silence that had followed. In that silence, She'd heard everything: the weight of command, the burden of impossible choices, the cost of being the person others turned to when there were no good options left. Tomorrow, she would gather her team and explain what they would be asked to do. Tomorrow, she would study the mission files and plan an operation that 2 previous teams had died attempting. Tomorrow, she would try to find a way to bring Lieutenant Park home without adding more names to the casualty lists. But tonight, she would sit in her quarters and stare at the photograph of a young father with kind eyes, and she would try not to think about the silence that followed when someone said her call sign. Tonight, she would carry the weight of command alone, the way she always had, the way she always would. Because that's what Specter 6 did. That's who she had become. The Tactical Operations Center was alive with the quiet intensity of pre-mission preparation. Sarah stood before a digital map that covered an entire wall, the blue glow casting shadows across her face as she studied the terrain that would either bring Lieutenant Park home or claim more lives. The clock on the wall read 2,347 hours, 13 minutes before her birthday, though no one in the room knew that, and she preferred it that way. Staff Sergeant Torres moved quietly around the room, checking equipment and coordinating with the intelligence team. The rest of her squad sat in a semicircle before the map, their faces illuminated by the tactical displays. These were her people, hand-picked over 2 years of operations that had tested them in ways most soldiers never experienced. Corporal Jessica Chen sat closest to the front, her slight frame belying the fact that she was one of the most accurate marksmen Sarah had ever worked with. Next to her, Sergeant First Class David Price cleaned his weapon with the methodical precision of someone who understood that details meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. The others, Rodriguez, Kim, Washington, Mueller, Jackson, Thompson, Patel, and Barnes, each carried their own specialties, their own demons, their own reasons for following Specter 6 into impossible situations. The compound sits in a valley approximately 2 kilometers east of Calat Village, Sarah began, her voice cutting through the low hum of electronics. Intelligence suggests 12 to 15 hostile combatants, but previous missions encountered significantly more resistance than anticipated. She clicked a remote, and the display shifted to show satellite imagery of their target. The compound looked deceptively simple from above, a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by a low wall, set against the backdrop of barren hills that stretched toward the horizon. The first extraction team approached from the north, Sarah continued, highlighting their route with a laser pointer. They encountered a kill zone approximately here. The red dot settled on what looked like empty ground between 2 hills. 7 casualties, including the team leader. The room remained silent, but Sarah could feel the shift in atmosphere. They'd all read the mission reports, but hearing the details spoken aloud gave them weight that words on paper couldn't carry. The second team tried an eastern approach, she continued. They made it closer to the compound before encountering resistance. 4 casualties, including their team leader. The red dot moved to mark another position, closer to their objective but still short of success. Corporal Chan raised her hand. "Ma'am, what's the intelligence assessment on why both missions failed?" Sarah had been dreading that question because she'd spent the last 6 hours studying every detail of the failed missions, and the answer wasn't something any of them wanted to hear. The compound is more heavily defended than initial intelligence suggested. Both teams encountered coordinated resistance that indicates training beyond what we'd expect from local militants. The working theory is that this is a high-value detention facility, possibly used for multiple prisoners. Sergeant Price looked up from his weapon. Multiple prisoners? Intelligence indicates at least 3 Western captives being held at the location. Lieutenant Park is our primary objective, but... Sarah paused, feeling the weight of the decision she was about to announce. If the opportunity presents itself to extract additional prisoners, we are authorized to expand the mission scope. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't just about bringing one man home anymore, this was about the possibility of saving 3 lives, but at exponentially increased risk to her own team. "Ma'am," Torres said quietly, "what's the exfiltration plan if we're carrying multiple casualties?" It was a good question, and Sarah had been dreading it because the answer revealed just how desperate this mission really was. 2 extraction choppers will be on standby. Primary LZ is here, approximately 3 kilometers southwest of the compound. Secondary LZ is here, another 2 kilometers south. she marked the positions on the map, but they all knew what she wasn't saying. If they had to use the secondary LZ, it meant the primary plan had failed. If they had to carry multiple prisoners across 5 kilometers of hostile territory, some of them might not make it home. Rodriguez, their communications specialist, cleared his throat. What about air support? Limited. We'll have drone overwatch, but the political situation means no close air support unless we're facing complete mission failure. Sarah set down the remote and turned to face her team directly. This is a stealth operation first, rescue mission second, combat operation only as a last resort. The words sounded reasonable, even sensible, but everyone in the room knew how quickly stealth operation could become desperate fighting retreat when bullets started flying. Thompson, their medic, spoke up. Medical facilities at the compound? Unknown. We should assume any prisoners will need immediate medical attention. I want you prepared for everything from malnutrition to torture injuries. Sarah's voice remained steady, but she could see the impact of her words in Thompson's expression. Torture? Chen asked quietly. Sarah had hoped to avoid this discussion, but her team deserved to know what they might be walking into. The previous extraction attempts suggest the captors are willing to use extreme measures to prevent rescue. We should be prepared for the possibility that the prisoners' conditions may be severe. Barnes, their demolitions expert, was studying the compound layout on his tablet. Ma'am, the building layout suggests this might be a converted residential compound. If they're holding prisoners there, they've probably modified it significantly. Good observation. Intelligence suggests the main building has been reinforced, possibly with additional security measures. That's why we're going in at night, using thermal imaging to identify guard positions and prisoner locations before we commit. Sarah moved back to the map, feeling the familiar weight of command settling on her shoulders. Every decision from this point forward would ripple outward, affecting not just this mission but the lives of everyone in this room. Here's what we know about Lieutenant Park's condition, she said, clicking to a new display that showed medical assessments based on the limited intelligence they'd gathered. He's been in captivity for 3 weeks. Previous rescue attempts may have resulted in increased security and, potentially, harsh treatment. We should be prepared for the possibility that he may not be able to move under his own power. The implications of that statement hung in the air. If Lieutenant Park couldn't walk, someone would have to carry him. If they were carrying wounded prisoners across 5 kilometers of hostile territory while under fire, the mathematics of survival became very simple and very brutal. Patel, their youngest team member at 22, raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, what if we can't get everyone out? It was the question Sarah had been hoping no one would ask, the one that cut to the heart of why she was the one sitting in this room, holding this briefing, making these impossible choices. She looked at Patel's young face and saw herself 5 years ago, before she'd learned that sometimes there were no good choices, only necessary ones. Our primary objective is Lieutenant Park, she said carefully. Secondary objectives include any other prisoners we can safely extract. But the mission comes first, and the mission is to bring as many people home alive as possible. It wasn't really an answer, and they all knew it. What she was really saying was that if it came down to choosing between saving 1 life or losing 5, she would make the choice that saved the most people. It was the mathematics of command, cold and brutal and necessary. Torres moved to stand beside her, his presence a steady reminder that she wasn't carrying this weight alone. Departure is scheduled for 0800, he announced. Final equipment check at 0700. Questions? Kim, their intelligence specialist, consulted her notes. Communication protocols during the operation? Radio silence except for emergency situations. We'll use hand signals and predetermined rally points. If communications are compromised, individual team members are authorized to use their own judgment to complete the mission. Sarah's voice remained steady, but she could feel the weight of what she was authorizing. In combat situations, use your own judgment often meant making the kind of choices that would follow soldiers home for the rest of their lives. Rules of engagement? Mueller asked. Sarah had been dreading this question most of all. Rules of engagement in a mission like this were always complicated, but when civilian casualties were possible and political considerations were paramount, they became nearly impossible to navigate. Minimize civilian casualties. Hostile forces are defined as anyone actively opposing the mission. Use of lethal force is authorized when necessary to protect team members or prisoners. She paused, looking at each face in turn. But remember, our job is to get in, get our people, and get out. Every shot fired increases the chance that this mission fails. Washington, their second marksman, was studying the compound layout intently. Sentry positions? Intelligence suggests 4 permanent guard positions, with roving patrols every 30 minutes. Thermal imaging indicates approximately 12 people in the compound during nighttime hours, but we should be prepared for additional security measures that don't show up on satellite surveillance. The briefing continued for another hour, covering every detail from weather conditions to ammunition loads to emergency medical procedures. Sarah watched her team absorb the information, saw them begin the mental process of preparing for what they would face in less than 8 hours. When the last question had been answered and the final piece of equipment checked, Sarah dismissed the team with instructions to get what rest they could. They filed out quietly, each carrying their own thoughts about what tomorrow would bring. Torres remained behind, his weathered face showing the strain of too many missions like this one. "Sarah," he said quietly, using her first name in the empty room. "This one feels different." She knew what he meant. In 2 years of impossible missions, they'd developed an instinct for the ones that would cost them dearly. This mission had that feeling from the beginning: too many variables, too many unknowns, too many ways for everything to go wrong. "I know," she said simply. "The kid, Patel, he's got a wife. Baby due in 3 months. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that information settle on her shoulders alongside everything else. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to have to make choices out there. Hard choices. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, whatever happens, we trust you." The words should have been comforting, but instead they felt like another burden added to an already crushing load. Trust was a heavy thing to carry, especially when the decisions ahead might require betraying that trust to keep people alive. "Get some rest, Mike," she said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." After he left, Sarah stood alone in the Tactical Operations Center, surrounded by maps and intelligence reports and casualty assessments. In 6 hours, she would lead 12 people into a situation that had already killed 11 others. In 6 hours, she would begin making the kind of choices that would define not just this mission, but who she was as a person. She thought about Lieutenant Park, alone in a cell somewhere in the Afghan darkness, not knowing that another rescue attempt was being planned. She thought about his children, sleeping safely in their beds thousands of miles away, trusting that someone would bring their father home. And she thought about her team, trusting her to lead them into darkness and bring them out again, not knowing that she'd already begun calculating the terrible mathematics of who might come home and who might not. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the operations center and carrying with it the scent of dust and distant fires. Tomorrow would bring heat and blood and impossible choices. Tonight, she had a few hours to carry the weight of command alone, the way she always had, the way she always would. Because that's what Specter 6 did. The desert air was still cold when the helicopters lifted off at 0800, carrying 12 soldiers toward a destiny none of them could have imagined. Sarah felt the familiar vibration of the aircraft through her body as she watched the Afghan landscape scroll past below, endless stretches of brown earth broken by villages that looked like scattered stones from this height. The flight to the insertion point took 47 minutes, enough time for her to review the mission parameters one final time and notice how quiet her team had become. Pre-mission nerves were normal, but this silence felt different, heavier. Even Torres, usually steady as granite, was checking and rechecking his equipment with the methodical intensity of someone who expected the worst. 5 minutes to insertion, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. Sarah looked down at the valley below, seeing nothing but empty hills and scattered rocks. Somewhere down there, Lieutenant Park was waiting for rescue that might never come. The helicopters touched down in a cloud of dust and departed immediately, their rotors fading into the distance until the only sound was the wind across the rocks. Sarah's team moved with practiced efficiency, establishing a perimeter and checking their surroundings for any signs of hostile activity. Clear, Torres reported quietly, his voice barely audible over the radio. Sarah consulted her GPS and pointed toward a ridgeline approximately 2 kilometers to the east. The compound lay beyond those hills, hidden in a valley that satellite imagery suggested was perfect for an ambush. 2 previous teams had learned that lesson the hard way. They moved across the terrain in a tactical formation that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises, but the rocks beneath their feet and the heat building with the rising sun reminded them that this was no exercise. Chen took point, her slight frame moving like a shadow between the scattered boulders. Behind her, the rest of the team maintained spacing that would prevent a single enemy burst from taking out multiple soldiers. The first indication that something was wrong came after they'd been moving for an hour. Chen raised her fist, signaling the team to halt, then pointed toward a cluster of rocks about 300 meters ahead. Through her scope, Sarah could see what had caught Chen's attention: fresh tire tracks in the dirt, too new to have been made by the previous rescue attempts. Torres low-crawled to Sarah's position, his face grim. Those tracks weren't in the intelligence reports. Sarah studied the marks through her binoculars, feeling a cold certainty settle in her stomach. The tracks were fresh, probably made within the last 12 hours. Either their intelligence was wrong about the level of activity in the area, or someone had been expecting them. Possible ambush site? Torres whispered. Sarah considered their options, none of them good. They could detour around the suspected ambush point, but that would add hours to their approach and put them in the compound during daylight. They could call for additional reconnaissance, but that risked compromising the entire mission. Or they could proceed as planned and hope their suspicions were wrong. We go around, Sarah decided. Northern route, even if it costs us time. They altered course, adding an extra hour to their approach but avoiding the suspicious area entirely. Sarah told herself it was the right choice, even as she felt the weight of time slipping away. Every minute they spent in the field increased the chances that their presence would be detected. The northern approach took them through a series of ravines that provided excellent cover but limited visibility. Sarah found herself constantly checking the high ground, expecting to see the muzzle flash of an enemy sniper at any moment. The tension was wearing on all of them. She could see it in the way Patel's hands shook slightly as he checked his ammunition, in the way Rodriguez kept adjusting his radio equipment with nervous energy. They reached the observation point overlooking the compound at 1,347 hours, almost 3 hours behind schedule. Sarah immediately understood why the previous missions had failed. The intelligence reports had described a simple compound with minimal security, but what lay before them was clearly a fortress designed to withstand exactly this type of assault. The walls were higher than reported, reinforced with what looked like concrete barriers. Guard towers had been added at each corner, and thermal imaging revealed at least 20 heat signatures inside the compound, not the 12 to 15 they'd been expecting. Worst of all, there were clear fields of fire covering every possible approach route. "This isn't what we planned for," Torres murmured, settling in beside Sarah with his own binoculars. Sarah studied the compound through her scope, her trained mind automatically calculating angles of attack, cover positions, and casualty probabilities. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion: this mission, as currently planned, was going to get most of her team killed. "Movement in the main building," Chen reported quietly. "Second floor, eastern window." Sarah shifted her focus to the building Chen had indicated. Through her scope, she could see a figure moving past a window, briefly visible before disappearing back into the shadows. It could have been a guard, or it could have been one of the prisoners. There was no way to know without getting closer. Kim, monitoring radio frequencies from a concealed position, looked up with concern. "I'm picking up increased radio chatter. Multiple voices, coordinated communications. This isn't random security, they're running organized patrols." The pieces were falling into place, and Sarah didn't like the picture they were forming. This wasn't just a detention facility, it was a trap. Someone had turned this compound into a killing ground, and 2 previous rescue teams had walked right into it. "Ma'am," Patel whispered, his young face pale with realization. "They know we're coming." Sarah felt the cold certainty settle deeper into her bones. The fresh tire tracks, the reinforced compound, the increased security, it all pointed to one conclusion. Somehow, their mission had been compromised. The enemy wasn't just waiting for Lieutenant Park's rescue, they were waiting for her team.
Options? Torres asked quietly.
Sarah considered their situation with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through 2 years of impossible missions. They could abort, call for extraction, and leave Lieutenant Park to whatever fate awaited him. They could proceed with the original plan and, almost certainly, lose most of the team. Or they could adapt, improvise, and hope that their training and experience could overcome the disadvantages they faced.
"We modify the plan," she said finally. "Smaller team, different approach.
The compound is too well defended for a direct assault, but they're expecting us to come at night using standard tactics."
Torres frowned. "What are you thinking?"
Sarah was thinking about the impossible mathematics of command, about the weight of 12 lives against one, about the families waiting at home for people who might not be coming back. She was thinking about Lieutenant Park's children and the promise General Harrison had made to bring their father home. "Daylight assault," she said quietly. "Single team, eastern approach, during the guard change."
The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Daylight assault meant no cover of darkness, no element of surprise, no margin for error.
It also meant that if they failed, the evidence of their failure would be visible to any observer with binoculars. "Sarah," Torres said, using her first name in the way that meant he was speaking as a friend, not a subordinate.
"That's suicide." She knew he was right.
Every tactical manual ever written said that what she was proposing was madness. But every tactical manual was written by people who'd never faced the choice between certain failure and probable suicide.
"Not all of us," she said quietly. 4-person team.
Myself, Chen, Price, and Thompson.
The rest of you provide overwatch and extraction support."
The silence that followed was deafening. She was asking 4 people to walk into almost certain death while the rest watched from safety. She was asking her team to trust her judgment when her judgment was telling her to do something that violated every principle of military tactics. "Ma'am," Chen said quietly, "permission to volunteer for the assault team." Sarah looked at the young corporal, seeing her own determination reflected in Chen's eyes.
"Denied. I'm not asking for volunteers. I'm giving orders."
"With respect, ma'am, you can't order someone to commit suicide," Rodriguez said from his position. "And you can't order the rest of us to watch while you do it."
Sarah felt the weight of command pressing down on her like a physical force.
These people trusted her, followed her, would die for her if she asked them to. And now she was asking them to let her die for them.
"The mission," she began. "The mission is to bring people home alive," Barnes interrupted. "All of us. Including you."
Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the desert sun beat down on her face and the weight of impossible choices pressing against her chest. When she opened them again, she saw her team watching her with expressions that mixed trust and concern and stubborn loyalty.
"Then, we find another way," she said finally.
"But, Lieutenant Park doesn't spend another night in that compound."
"Whatever we do it today."
The afternoon stretched ahead of them like an eternity, filled with planning and preparation and the growing certainty that they were about to attempt something that had never been done before. Sarah found herself thinking about the silence that had followed General Harrison's words, about the weight of being the person others turned to when there were no good choices left. Outside the compound, guards moved in patterns that spoke of training and discipline.
Inside, somewhere in those reinforced buildings, Lieutenant Park waited for rescue that was coming whether it made tactical sense or not. Because that's what Specter 6 did. That's who she had become.
And if today was the day that burden finally crushed her, at least she would carry it to the end. The plan they settled on was born from desperation and refined by experience, a combination of calculated risk and controlled madness that would either save Lieutenant Park or destroy them all. Sarah lay on her belly in the rocky outcropping, watching the compound through her scope as the afternoon shadows grew longer, waiting for the moment when everything would change forever. They had identified a weakness in the compound's defenses, a brief window during the evening guard rotation when the eastern wall would be momentarily unwatched. The window would last exactly 90 seconds, barely enough time for a two-person team to scale the wall and establish a position inside the compound.
It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only chance they had. Movement in the northwest tower, Chen reported quietly. Guard change beginning.
Sarah felt her heartbeat steady into the rhythm she'd learned during 2 years of impossible missions.
Time seemed to slow, each second stretching like an eternity as she watched the guards move through their rotation with mechanical precision.
In 60 seconds, she and Price would be moving across open ground toward a wall that might be their salvation or their tomb. "Radio check," Torres whispered into his headset.
"Lima 1, good signal," Chen responded. "Lima 2, good signal," Rodriguez confirmed. "Lima 3, good signal," Kim added. One by one, her team confirmed their readiness.
8 soldiers spread across the hillsides overlooking the compound, each in position to provide overwatch and suppressing fire when the shooting started. Because despite all their planning and preparation, Sarah knew that the shooting would start.
It always did.
"Thermal shows 3 guards moving toward the main building," Kim reported. 2 heat signatures still in the guard towers, but the eastern wall is clear. Sarah felt the familiar weight of command settle on her shoulders as she checked her weapon one final time. Beside her, Price was breathing steadily, his weathered face calm despite the impossibility of what they were about to attempt. He'd volunteered for this part of the mission, insisted on it despite Sarah's protests. "You can't do everything alone, Cap," he'd said.
"And someone needs to watch your back." 30 seconds, Torres announced.
Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about Lieutenant Park somewhere in that compound, waiting for rescue that might never come. She thought about his children, sleeping safely thousands of miles away, trusting that someone would bring their father home. She thought about her team, spread across the hills around her, ready to die to make this mission succeed.
10 seconds.
Sarah opened her eyes and focused on the eastern wall of the compound, calculating the distance, the time, the thousand things that could go wrong in the next few minutes. Beside her, Price checked his weapon one final time and gave her a nod that said he was ready for whatever came next.
"Go."
They moved across the open ground like shadows, covering the distance to the compound wall in 43 seconds of heart-pounding terror. Sarah's feet found purchase on the rough stones, and she hauled herself up and over the wall with Price right behind her. They landed in a small courtyard, immediately taking cover behind a stack of supply crates as voices echoed from somewhere deeper in the compound. The intelligence reports had described a simple layout, but the reality was far more complex. Additional buildings had been constructed inside the walls, creating a maze of structures and alleyways that could hide dozens of enemies. Sarah signaled Price to move toward the main building while she provided cover, her finger resting on the trigger of her weapon as she scanned for threats. "Specter 6, this is Lima 1, Chen's voice whispered in her earpiece.
2 guards moving toward your position from the north." Sarah could hear footsteps approaching, voices speaking in what sounded like Pashto.
She signaled Price to freeze as 2 figures rounded the corner of a nearby building, assault rifles held casually at their sides. They were talking quietly, apparently unaware that their compound had been breached.
The next 30 seconds would determine whether this mission succeeded or failed catastrophically.
If Sarah and Price were discovered, the alarm would be raised and their team would face the full defensive strength of the compound. If they could eliminate these guards silently, they might still have a chance of reaching Lieutenant Park. Sarah made her decision with the cold calculation that had kept her alive through 2 years of impossible choices.
She signaled Price to take the left target while she took the right.
They moved simultaneously, covering the distance in 3 quick strides before the guards realized they were there. The kills were quick and silent, professional work that neither of them would ever discuss afterward. Sarah caught her target's body as it fell, lowering it to the ground without sound while Price did the same with his target. For a moment, they knelt in the courtyard beside 2 men who would never go home to their families, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of necessary death settle on her conscience. "Clear," she whispered into her radio. They moved toward the main building, staying in the shadows and avoiding the open areas where thermal imaging might detect them. The building was larger than it had appeared from the observation point, with multiple floors and what looked like a basement level.
If Lieutenant Park was being held here, he could be anywhere.
Multiple heat signatures on the second floor, Kim reported through their earpieces.
East side of the building, 3 distinct forms.
Sarah felt her pulse quicken.
3 forms could mean 3 prisoners, or it could mean 2 guards and 1 prisoner, or any number of other possibilities. There was only one way to find out, and it meant going deeper into a building that was almost certainly defended by more guards than they'd seen so far. They found a service entrance on the building's south side, a metal door that was secured with a lock that Price defeated in less than 30 seconds. Sarah went through first, her weapon raised and ready, Price following close behind. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lighting that cast strange shadows on the walls. The building smelled like fear and violence, the lingering odors of unwashed bodies and something else Sarah didn't want to identify. They moved carefully down a corridor lined with what looked like cells, most of them empty but showing signs of recent occupation. "Contact," Price whispered, pointing toward a stairway at the end of the corridor. Sarah could hear voices coming from above, at least 3 different people speaking in urgent tones. One of the voices was speaking English, heavily accented, but definitely English. Her heart raced as she realized they might have found what they were looking for. They climbed the stairs with infinite care, each step a potential betrayal that could bring guards running from every direction. At the top, Sarah peered around the corner and saw a sight that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. 3 men were chained to chairs in what had once been a living room, their faces swollen with recent beatings. The one on the left was clearly Lieutenant Park. His photograph hadn't done justice to the intelligence and determination visible even through the bruises and exhaustion. The other 2 were strangers, but their uniforms identified them as coalition forces. 2 guards stood over the prisoners, holding assault rifles and speaking in low voices. As Sarah watched, one of them backhanded Park across the face, saying something in Pashto that made the other guard laugh. Sarah felt rage build in her chest, cold and controlled but absolute in its intensity. These men had tortured prisoners who couldn't defend themselves, who were someone's fathers and sons and husbands. They had turned human beings into objects of entertainment and cruelty. She signaled Price to circle around while she provided covering fire. They had one chance to take both guards before either could raise an alarm or hurt the prisoners. One chance to justify the risks they'd taken and the lives they'd already spent getting this far. The engagement lasted exactly 4 seconds. Price took the left guard with a single shot to the center of mass while Sarah eliminated the right guard with 2 quick rounds to the chest. Both men dropped without a sound, their weapons clattering to the floor beside them. "Friendlies," Sarah called out softly, approaching the prisoners with her weapon lowered. "We're here to get you out." Lieutenant Park looked up at her through swollen eyes, his face showing a mixture of hope and disbelief. "American?" he asked, his voice hoarse from dehydration. "Yes, sir." "Captain Mitchell, U.S. Army. We're here to bring you home." Price was already working on the chains that held the prisoners, his lockpicking tools making quick work of the crude restraints. The other 2 prisoners were barely conscious, showing signs of severe malnutrition and abuse that would require immediate medical attention. "Can you walk?" Sarah asked Park as his chains fell away. "I think so," Park replied, struggling to his feet. His legs shook with the effort, but he remained upright. "How many of you are there?" "Enough," Sarah said, helping him toward the stairs. Behind them, Price was supporting the other 2 prisoners, both of whom were barely able to stand. They had made it halfway down the stairs when the alarm began to sound, a piercing wail that echoed through the building and across the compound. Someone had discovered the bodies in the courtyard, or noticed that the guards were missing, or simply become suspicious about the unusual quiet. "Specter 6, this is Lima 1, Chen's voice crackled through Sarah's earpiece. "Multiple hostile forces moving toward your position. You have maybe 2 minutes before you're surrounded." Sarah felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. They had found Lieutenant Park and 2 additional prisoners, but getting them out of the compound alive was going to require a miracle. The prisoners were in no condition to move quickly, and Sarah's team was outnumbered by at least 3 to 1. "Lima 1, we need covering fire on the eastern wall," Sarah ordered as they reached the ground floor. "All units, prepare for emergency extraction." The next few minutes unfolded like a nightmare choreographed by someone with a sadistic sense of timing.
Sarah and Price moved through the building toward the exit while supporting three barely conscious prisoners, the sound of approaching footsteps echoing from multiple directions. Outside, the distinctive crack of sniper fire indicated that Chen was providing the covering fire Sarah had requested. They emerged into the courtyard to find chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness as Sarah's team provided suppressing fire from their positions in the hills, while guards poured out of buildings throughout the compound. Sarah counted at least 15 hostile forces, all of them converging on their position with the coordination of trained soldiers. "This way," Price shouted, pointing toward a gap in the perimeter fence that explosive charges had opened while they were inside the building. Barnes had been busy during their absence, creating an escape route that hadn't existed in any of their plans. They ran across open ground while bullets whined through the air around them, Sarah supporting Lieutenant Park while Price carried one of the other prisoners over his shoulder like a sack of grain. The third prisoner was barely conscious but somehow managed to keep moving on legs that shook with exhaustion and malnutrition. "Lima 2, we need immediate extraction," Sarah gasped into her radio as they reached the perimeter fence. "3 packages plus 2 escorts, emergency medical required." "Extraction team is inbound," Torres responded, his voice tight with concern. "ETA 4 minutes. Can you hold that long?" Sarah looked back at the compound, where muzzle flashes indicated that at least a dozen enemy fighters were pursuing them. For minutes might as well have been 4 hours when you were carrying wounded prisoners across open ground while under fire. "We'll hold," she said, knowing that the mathematics of the situation made that promise questionable at best. They made it to the extraction point with 30 seconds to spare, collapsing behind the rocky outcropping just as the helicopters appeared on the horizon. The sound of rotors had never been more beautiful to Sarah's ears, a mechanical symphony that meant the difference between life and death. The extraction itself was a controlled chaos of medical personnel and crew chiefs hauling people into helicopters while return fire from the compound sparked off the rocks around them. Sarah found herself pushed into a seat beside Lieutenant Park, watching the Afghan landscape fall away below them as the helicopters gained altitude and distance from the nightmare they'd just escaped. "Is everyone out?" she asked Torres, who was slumped in the seat across from her with what looked like a bullet graze across his shoulder. "Everyone's out," he confirmed. 12 went in, 12 came out. Plus 3 packages. Sarah closed her eyes and felt the weight of command finally begin to lift from her shoulders. They had done the impossible, not just rescued Lieutenant Park, but brought home 2 additional prisoners while suffering no casualties among her own team. It was the kind of mission that would be studied in tactical schools and written about in after-action reports, the kind of mission that justified 2 years of impossible choices and sleepless nights. Later, much later, after the debriefings and medical examinations and paperwork that followed any successful operation, Sarah sat alone in her quarters and tried to process what they had accomplished. 3 men were alive because she had made the choice to attempt an impossible mission. Her team was intact because she had planned carefully and adapted quickly when the situation changed. But she also knew that somewhere in Afghanistan, 2 families were mourning guards who had died in that compound, men who might have been fathers and sons and husbands, regardless of what they had done to their prisoners. She knew that the success of this mission would lead to other impossible missions, other impossible choices, other nights spent calculating the terrible mathematics of command. The next morning, General Harrison called her to his office. This time, there was no briefing table, no maps, no folders marked with classified symbols. Just a tired general and a soldier who had carried the weight of impossible decisions and somehow found a way to make them work. "Well done, Captain," he said simply. Sarah stood at attention, feeling the weight of what those words meant. Success in missions like this one came with its own burden, the knowledge that she would be called upon again and again to do things that others couldn't or wouldn't do. "Sir," she replied. General Harrison studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah could see something like sympathy in his eyes. "The families of Lieutenant Park and the other prisoners you brought home wanted me to thank you personally. They wanted you to know that their husbands and fathers are alive because of what you did." The words should have been comforting, but Sarah found herself thinking about the families of the men who hadn't come home from that compound. War was the equation that never balanced cleanly. Every victory came at a cost that someone else would have to pay. "Yes, sir," she said. "There's another mission coming up," General Harrison said quietly. "High priority, classified, the kind of thing that requires someone with your particular skills. Sarah felt the familiar weight settling on her shoulders again, the burden of being the person others turned to when there were no good choices left. She thought about Lieutenant Park, recovering in a hospital bed with his family at his side. She thought about her team, proud of what they had accomplished and ready to follow her into the next impossible situation.
"When do you need an answer?" she asked. "Take some time. Think about it."
"But, Sarah." He paused, and, in that pause, she heard everything he couldn't say officially.
"We need people like you.
The world needs people willing to carry burdens that would break others." Later that night, Sarah sat on her bunk and stared at a letter that had been waiting for her, a thank you note from Lieutenant Park's wife, written in a hand that shook with gratitude and relief. The letter talked about children who would grow up knowing their father was alive, about Christmas mornings and birthday parties and bedtime stories that wouldn't have happened without the choices Sarah had made in an Afghan compound. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her footlocker beside similar letters from other missions, other families, other lives that had been touched by the impossible decisions that came with being Specter 6. Tomorrow there would be another briefing, another impossible mission, another opportunity to calculate the terrible mathematics of command. But tonight, she had the weight of success to carry, the knowledge that sometimes impossible choices led to outcomes that justified everything. Tonight, she could close her eyes and know that she had become exactly who she was meant to be, the person who made the hard choices so others didn't have to. Because that's what Specter 6 did. That's who she would always be.